Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this video about going over my notes from Participatory Design and Action Research, Identical Twins or Synergetic Pair. I'm going to zoom in and I'm mostly going to be focusing on the things that I've highlighted and looking at them from the lens of a designer within open source, and if appropriate, also with a humanitarian or human rights lens. So we've got the first two highlighted sections here about the first study following a participatory design approach, and the second study is guided by action research principles. Not much to say there except for the definition between participatory design and action research. It tends to be in the former, participatory design being solutions focused and action research being knowledge and collaboration focused. Not that each doesn't have a focus with working with the community for a co-design purpose. I'm still finding the definition between participatory design and action research a little confusing generally, but we'll see throughout the reading to see if it becomes any clearer. The second section I've got highlighted here is social research usually involves humans. Technical research involves the design, development, and evaluation of technical artifacts, which are used in one way or another by or for humans. Participatory or participative research encourages these people to take part and share in the research activity to ensure it is authentic, useful, fair, ethical, and relevant. And then it goes on to say that the core idea of participation is to shorten the communicative distance between research activity and real-world activity, between researcher and research. This wasn't necessarily highlighted, but I believe the reason that I highlighted the other sections is how just the way that engagement and that collaboration and involvement with the subject is described by researchers, like the participants within the subjects, and how they describe taking part and the authenticity and things like that. And also this interesting, slightly odd separation of social research involving humans and technical research involving design, development, and evaluation of technical artifacts which are used by humans. And I think that this interests me from an open source perspective, given that these things are so deeply intertwined, in that the technical artifact is used by humans, but also co-created and built within community. So it's not necessarily always built in a way that is it's a less traditional software development space and more of a communicative collaboration community space. So therefore, does it become closer to social research, or how close does it become to social research as opposed to the technical research? And what are the intersections here between these two sort of definitions, and how are they combined with when I look at how design is done within open source software? Which is an interesting question, but I don't have many answers to that yet at all. Two participatory research methodologies, similarities and differences of participatory design and action research, and understanding and assisting communities. I think just the fact to highlight that they've done or investigated two different research approaches, and also just this statement about understanding and assisting communities is, again, similar to open source software in the sense of open source software is often built to assist communities, but also the process of contributing to them and participating in them is assisting communities that you either are part of or are not part of. And like there is that the contribution to and participation in open source, building open source, is assisting communities. So again, an interesting way of looking at open source there. One of the key intentions of participatory research is to find ways for people to get involved in research and design activities that may impact on them, which is this then allows them to define goals, contribute on their own terms, and in an emancipated manner, and take ownership of decision-making processes. So I wrote in the notes here just OSS question mark, in the sense that that often describes, or that describes to me, or is similar to a lot of open source software contribution collaboration practices. Open source software is often built, but not necessarily always built for the purpose of getting other people involved in the research and design of the activities that may impact on them, but often by open source software existing to solve a particular problem for a single person, it often then becomes discovered as a solution for another person having a similar or the same problem. And then there is this negotiation, maybe best way to describe it, or this way of becoming involved that actually can be done in multiple different ways, either in co-creation, in collaboration, in contribution, or it can be, taken and remixed and re-owned and made closed or further opened. But really, the similarities to participatory research being how to find ways to get people involved in the research and design of what may impact on them is often what designers are stepping into within open source software spaces, in the sense that how do designers in open source software spaces understand or get people who are already maybe involved in a contribution process or have been involved in a contribution process which is less visible, and how do you work with them to understand what their needs are, or work with them on the software, and how do you work alongside them? That's a big question. But yeah, open source is often defined by how people individually decide to contribute on their own terms, which I think is apparent in a lot of open source software, although you can argue that some open source software has structures in which you don't necessarily, you either conform to a governance structure or a contribution structure that is pre-agreed or that you subscribe to, in a sense. Or you can then, take it and leave and do something else with it. But I think what is being described here is a wider participatory approach with more people about decisions that impact on them as a collective and as a whole, rather than individuals. And ownerships of decision-making processes are pretty apparent within open source community structures, within governance and things like that, once they arrive at that space. But ownership is an interesting word and a difficult word, I think, to think about within an open source context. Ownership is. That really often relates I was going to say strictly back to the license, but it often doesn't. It's not always strictly back to the license, but it refers to a license usually. The process of participation in itself is in most cases complex. It's true of open source. Mutual trust and rapport between researchers and participants is one of the most challenging tasks. I think that is also the case between design researchers within open source. It's a challenging task to be trusted within the open source space, especially when you're coming in a slightly different context or a different culture or a different non-well-established as, say, coding development is. Specific goals of PD include participation of stakeholders with different areas of expertise, iterative prototyping of ideas, and co-determination of technologies and work practices. It focuses on preserving existing social systems and attempts to manage technology development and roll out in a humanistic fashion. PD advocates for the collaboration of researchers, developers, workers, and management to produce workable designs which help to improve the lives of those that use it. PD uses informal processes with a strong emphasis on ethnographic and in situ methods and frequent user involvement. I think that this is often how design hopes to be practiced within open source. I don't know whether it's always successful, but it's interesting to look at the connection between how PD self-describes as being involved in this and how doing design, how I have observed doing design within open source follows a lot of this. This is often a lot of the hope. So participation with stakeholders of different areas of expertise, collaboration of all different people, with the idea that you are there to also improve the lives of those that use it, as well as it being open source in and of itself, and informal processes with strong kind of ethnographic and in situ methods, which are often kind of, you could describe as like the ways in which designers in open source, or specifically drawing on my own experience, have not really engaged with that kind of top down, here's the design and deliver the design development process, but made design much more of a conversational, what do we think will work within this situation, and how do we want it to be embedded within the community as a community decision, if at all, and how. So yeah, I think that that's interesting to see the connection between PD generally and PD work in this space, and also how I have observed open source design being practiced in open source. Prototyping to co-develop suitable technologies. Technologies produced by PD tend to augment human abilities in existing job functions, and they are often requested by the users themselves. I don't know how open source fits within this, but I think it's a really interesting question, because it made me think, this statement makes me think a lot about how I spoke previously about the difference between, or the perceived difference between, the people that are part of open source that build and are also end users, and the end users that do not build as well. So the ones that do not contribute and use open source. Whether or not they have the ability to is not really the question, but often you find the end users requesting things to be changed or things to be improved and things to augment. And I think the question I have here is that participatory design would hope to include those at the same level of importance as the people that also build and use, but that it is difficult, for lack of a better term, to do that within open source because various different structures. So I'd like to find a way to interrogate those kinds of structures within open source, and how PD tries to do more of that, and how that might affect open source, especially within a humanitarian and human rights context, where it's a lot more critical for the humanitarian and human rights open source software to be well tuned to the people, the end users requesting what is needed, because they are not always going to be, and very often not, the people that can participate in the build of open source that they use, that is critical to their lives a lot of the time. The imperative of an AR project is not only to understand and report on a given problem, but also to provoke change through action. Action researchers immerse themselves with the subjects under investigation in order to connect with them and encourage them to directly participate in the project as co-investigators. And I think this is often, I've tried these two different approaches without really knowing the definition of these two different approaches within open source communities before. And the latter of action research is one that I've tried to work with more recently, in that it's about bringing as many people, both on like the build and the end use side of things, and the end use side of things, into that space where they can co-design and co-investigate and participate in the project in a more, let's just say, equitable way. AR is defined by constant cycle, planning, acting, observing, and reflecting. So this is the spiral diagram that I've seen in the descriptions of action research. Oscillating engages all project stakeholders in constantly oscillating between knowledge generation and critically informed reflection in a helix directed at reaching a stage of improvement from which the process can start all over again, but this time towards an even higher level of understanding and achievement. I think this is a reiteration of a previous statement, but I think that this is often how open source and design within open source can generally improve, which is, and become more sustainable, which is about not just providing and doing a solutions-based participatory design approach to delivering, but this is about building the critical informed reflection processes within that are part of action research within open source, so that I see here a thread of like how sustainability becomes part of open source software, and therefore like the health of it, and therefore like the more empowerment of it, and how designers can really make a impact. AR is not defined by the use of qualitative or participatory methods. It is actually not restricted to any distinct method at all. It usually benefits from soft methods that tend to pay particular attention to the fuzziness of research involving humans. Difficult within an open source space, like soft and fuzzy kind of methods are hard to quantify and therefore hard to advocate for in an open source space, which often is or has historically been reliant on a visible outputs, even if it's just visible output of code, way of understanding contribution. So I think that this is interesting but difficult within the open source space. I think that the next sections here are about one of the studies. The study departed from the notion that a mere reappropriation of systems used to support dispersed virtual communities of interest is adequate to meet the place and proximity-based design requirements that social networks in urban neighborhoods pose. I think that this interested me because of the complexity of how you do design in a dispersed environment, virtual community environment within open source. The agenda of the action research approach was guided by specific objectives to analyze and understand the social fabric of residents within urban neighborhoods and how information and communication technology, especially internet-based tools and applications, could be used to facilitate meaningful neighborhood connections and social networks between residents. I mean, this is about a specific case study project, but I also am interested in that question, but in relation to open source software communities, like what is the social fabric of open source software, the residents of an open source software community or neighborhood. Improved and possibly contribute to making the apartment complex a better place to live for everyone. I mean, you can replace some words within that and with like open source and, you know, a tech stack, better tech stack for everyone, you know, so you could replace some of these words and kind of find a relation to open source software and the ethos and how it's built, and the aims, the hopes that it often has. Involved the users in the design process and attempted to create new technologies which satisfied multiple stakeholders affected by the product. The requirements they had, and see how prototypes were realistically used by them. So this is about the studies. Immersive research, participants to critically reflect on their own behavior and seek to comparatively improve it in multiple iterations. The study started without predefined tangible development outcomes, and thus it entered with a few preconceived technology goals. The study started without predefined tangible development outcomes, and thus it entered with a few preconceived technology goals. To inform a phase of targeted research and translate requirements into technical specifications, and then participatory design would be ideal for the next stage. Yeah, I think that this was highlighted because it was an interesting approach to, I suppose, a dispersed community. It might be, I think it's something that I wanted to pay attention to. But also I think that I was interested in this starting without predefined tangible development outcomes, but entered into preconceived technology goals. And this is often something that is a tension in open source projects, like the difference between predefined with trying to start without predefined tangible development outcomes, and then preconceived technology goals really always come into tension when you're trying to work in a co-design way. The structure of the backpacker community, nature of the social orientation faced by them, different intent. PD aspect of the study would allow the goal of the understanding, communication, and interaction needs to help form requirements and iterative design process. The IR aspect of the study would complement the PD work. AR ensures that any potential shifts in communication habits, interaction patterns, and power relationships associated with the rollout and the uptake of the new design solutions adequately captured by further critical reflection, evaluation, and informed action if necessary. So I think this is describing the way in which they linked participatory design approaches and then AR to make that specific project sustainable or able to. So it's almost like they kickstarted the project with a participatory design approach because it was a way of potentially maybe controlling the space a little bit more, because participatory design is a little bit more, for lack of a better term, like the designer researcher has some authority within the space to direct how the participation happens and helps to focus and refine what is an outcome of, whereas AR seeks to bring everyone from the community of influence or the community of use into an equal space to participate. And I think that can often be that kind of like quite chaotic space, but it does, when it is facilitated well, or when it happens in a way that is successful, it then allows for the community to own the process of improving what they have already participated in. So I can see why the two methods or the two sort of practices were linked. It kind of makes me think a little bit more deeply about whether like a pure action research approach to doing design within open source is too fuzzy, to use a term from earlier in the paper, or too soft, and that doing design within open source software might benefit from a linked participatory design and then a further action research approach, and how then makes me think more about how action research approaches link into existing contribution styles or existing contribution cultures within open source, and how does participatory design facilitate the entry of design into the space, and then action research facilitates the process of the community coming along with the design and then taking design approaches outside of the individual or group of designers that enter the open source space and allow it to have longevity, it being the design attitude and knowledge growth and approach for inclusion of the wider community in the design of the open source. So this kind of feels like a sort of daisy chain of links, potentially, or at the very least trying to look and see where participatory design fits in well to an open source process, and where action research fits well into an open source design process, and where it doesn't. And then what happens afterwards is at very least like of merit to investigate. In the conclusion, there is design tasks in the action phase will keep within a participatory spirit of the selection of design methods. At the same time, the participatory design study may be able to encourage its participants to determine and critically evaluate a range of open and perhaps non-design specific issues if action research principles are used. So I think that's what this is now, what I just described is what this conclusion is describing. So participatory design being like the action phase and encouraging the participatory spirit and selection of design methods, but then encouraging participants to critically evaluate and move into an action research principle space in order to have probably a sustainable project or intervention of some description. Okay, so that's that one finished. Some interesting sections here about the linkages between these design methods and these design practices and open source. So thank you for listening.